The daily routine. Officer Timothy Evans eased his patrol car along the winding roads of Birchwood Avenue, the low hum of the engine a comforting companion to the early morning silence. The sun was just beginning to stretch its golden fingers across the horizon, casting a soft warmth that contrasted with the crisp, cool air of the morning. Timothy had always appreciated these moments. The quiet before the storm of his duties, the calm before the chaos of the day, where the world seemed to breathe in unison with him. He was still wrapped in the solitude of the early hours, and for a moment, he allowed himself to lose the weight of responsibility that always followed him throughout the day. He adjusted his rearview mirror absently as his mind wandered to the familiar neighborhood ahead, a patchwork of neatly trimmed lawns and small homes that had stood here for decades. As his patrol car neared the corner of Birchwood and Maple, a sense of warmth bloomed in his chest, a sensation that had come to accompany this part of his morning for nearly 2 years. There it was again. The small white house at the end of the block, number 136. It stood at the very corner of Birchwood and Maple, its bright yellow door and flower boxes overflowing with blooms a welcoming sight. But it wasn't just the house that Timothy looked forward to every morning. It was what he would see at exactly 8:50 a.m. The twins. Kayla and Eliza. Their bright smiles, their untamed curls bouncing in the breeze, their matching dresses fluttering in time with the rhythm of their tiny waves. The twins had been part of Timothy's routine ever since his first day patrolling this neighborhood, 2 years ago. It wasn't just a passing greeting, they were more like a reminder of life's simple pleasures. Every morning, without fail, the girls would be standing on the porch of their home, as if waiting for him. With their small hands raised high, their waves were so full of joy that it was impossible not to smile in return. For a long time, Timothy didn't even understand why it meant so much to him. It was just a couple of kids, right? A small gesture, nothing extraordinary. Yet, for Timothy, it was the brightest part of his day. He didn't have children of his own anymore. He hadn't for years. His little girl, Lily, had died in a tragic accident, and that loss had left a gaping hole in his heart. It wasn't something that time could heal. It was a scar that had become part of him. And yet, when he saw the twins, something about their innocent enthusiasm, the way their eyes lit up when they saw him pass by, made him feel like he had a second chance at something he thought was lost forever. He was so caught up in his thoughts that he didn't even realize he was slowing the car until he was nearly at a stop. He forced himself to snap out of it, shifting into a lower gear and allowing the car to glide to the curb. As always, he kept an eye on the clock, 8:48 a.m. Just 2 minutes to go. There they were. Kayla and Eliza. The way they always stood, hands raised in cheerful waves, standing so still that it almost seemed like they were waiting for something bigger. They had a way of doing that, of giving the impression that nothing else mattered in those moments. It was as if their world and his collided at this precise intersection, each day, at this precise time. Timothy could still remember the first time he noticed them. It had been a particularly rough morning on his first week of patrol. He had been working the night shift, and his body had already started to feel the weight of exhaustion. He didn't know what to expect from his new beat, but when he first passed number 136, he saw the twins on their porch, their eyes wide and filled with excitement. They had waved at him, their smiles bright even in the gray light of dawn. It had been the smallest thing, but in that moment, he felt something shift inside of him. Every day since then, without fail, the twins were there, as if they had timed it just for him. It became a quiet tradition between them, an unspoken bond that made his patrols feel less solitary. He didn't know how they knew he would pass at that time, but it didn't matter. He looked forward to those fleeting moments more than anything. It was as if they had become a reminder of life itself, of the innocence, hope, and unshakable joy that the world could still offer, no matter how bleak things might seem. As he neared the corner this particular morning, he glanced over at the porch, his heart already bracing for the familiar sight of their waving hands. But today, something was different. The porch was empty. The twins were nowhere in sight. His foot lifted off the accelerator as his breath hitched in his chest. This wasn't right. Kayla and Eliza were always there, right on time, without fail. They had never missed a morning, not once in all the time he'd been patrolling the area. His pulse quickened, and his hands tightened around the steering wheel. The unease that began to stir within him only deepened when he saw no sign of their mother's figure either, who would typically be standing behind them, watching over them from the door. Timothy slowed the patrol car to a crawl, his eyes scanning the house. There was no movement. No sign of life at all. He glanced at the clock on his dashboard, 8:50 a.m., right on time. A cold shiver ran down his spine. His gut twisted with something that felt like dread. It wasn't normal for the girls to miss their spot. It wasn't normal for the house to be so still. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the growing knot in his stomach. He shook his head, dismissing the thoughts for a moment. Maybe they were just running late. Maybe they were still getting ready, or perhaps they had a sick day. Still, something about the silence, the absence, felt wrong, in a way he couldn't articulate. Timothy did the only thing he could think of. He turned his patrol car onto the next block, his foot pressing the pedal harder now, feeling an increasing sense of urgency. His eyes flickered back to number 136, trying to convince himself that everything was fine. But the sick feeling in his stomach wouldn't go away. Something was off. He pulled into a nearby driveway, threw the car into reverse, and sped back toward the house. His heart was thumping wildly now. He had to know what was going on. The empty porch. Timothy's heart raced as he sped down the block toward number 136, the familiar rhythm of his tires on the pavement now a jarring contrast to the overwhelming stillness that had settled over the street. He wasn't sure why, but something about the empty porch, the absence of Kayla and Eliza's usual bright energy, was gnawing at him like an insistent, unanswered question. His mind tried to rationalize it, to convince him that it was just a coincidence. But deep down, he knew. He couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something was wrong. The old oak tree that shaded the front of the house seemed to loom larger than usual in the growing morning light. The house stood like a quiet sentinel on the corner, its yellow door and white trim still welcoming in their simplicity. The air around it was oddly still, as if the whole world had hit pause, waiting for something to happen. The sense of unease settled deeper in his chest, the anticipation of something bad lurking just beyond his understanding. He parked his patrol car in front of the house, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the door handle. With a sharp breath, he stepped out, his boots making a dull thud against the concrete as he crossed the lawn toward the front door. His feet felt heavy as though the weight of his thoughts had suddenly become too much to bear. This was the moment that would tell him whether this was just a small oversight or the beginning of something much worse. His hand hovered over the doorknob for a second longer than he intended. He had knocked on doors plenty of times in his career, but this felt different. There was no knock on this door that could bring back the sense of normalcy he had always relied on. No polite request for help, no questioning of neighborhood activity. This felt like stepping into the unknown. He knocked softly at first, as if testing the air. The rhythmic sound echoed faintly across the empty porch, but there was no answer. He tried again, louder this time, his knuckles rapping more insistently against the door, but still, nothing. He waited for a few seconds, his breathing shallow, listening for any movement, any hint of life within the house. The silence that followed was deafening. A sense of foreboding crawled up his spine. A tightness in his chest made it difficult to breathe, and his instincts, those finely honed senses developed over years of patrolling, screamed at him that something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. He took a step back, looking at the door and the windows on either side, expecting to see some sign that the family was inside. The curtains were drawn, their pale fabric fluttering slightly in the morning breeze. It wasn't unusual for people to keep their blinds shut early in the morning, especially if they weren't awake yet. But Timothy felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. His gut told him that there was more to this stillness than met the eye. He turned to the side and noticed that the side gate, which normally led to the backyard, was slightly ajar. His eyes narrowed, and without a second thought, he walked toward it. The creak of the rusty hinges seemed louder than it should have been as he pushed it open, stepping cautiously onto the narrow path that led around the side of the house. He peered through the window into the kitchen, hoping to catch a glimpse of the twins' mother, Lucy, or at least one of the girls. Nothing. The kitchen was empty, but the faint smell of pancakes lingered in the air, a warm, nostalgic scent that made Timothy's heart tighten. He had seen Lucy preparing breakfast for the girls many times, their giggles filling the air as they argued over who would get the last blueberry muffin. The scent of food was always a comforting sign that everything was as it should be. But today, it was different. The kitchen, too, seemed abandoned. Timothy hesitated for only a moment before he pushed the door open. It was unlocked, which was unusual for a house in this neighborhood. Most people here took precautions, locking doors and windows, especially when they had children. The unease bubbling inside him intensified as he stepped into the cool, dimly lit hallway. "Hello?" he called out again, his voice shaking slightly. There was no response. The only sound now was the soft echo of his own words reverberating through the quiet house. He took a few more steps forward, his eyes scanning the familiar surroundings. The house was exactly as he remembered, but somehow it felt different now, like it was holding its breath, waiting for him to uncover something. As he made his way down the hall toward the living room, he was careful not to disturb anything. His boots made only the faintest sound against the hardwood floors. But it wasn't the sound of his steps that filled his ears now. It was the silence. The profound, unnerving silence that stretched out in every corner of the house, suffocating the air around him. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath. Reaching the living room, Timothy's eyes flickered over the scene in front of him. The room was as cozy as ever, the small couch with colorful throw pillows, the mismatched rug the twins loved to play on, the framed pictures on the walls showing the happy moments of the family's life. But there, in the far corner of the room, something caught his attention. It was the twins' toys, scattered carelessly on the floor, a few of them partially crushed under the weight of an overturned dollhouse. It was a jarring sight, out of place, out of rhythm. The sudden realization hit him hard, like a punch to the gut. He could tell that it wasn't just the twins who had left in a hurry. It was the mess. It wasn't their usual playful disorder. It was rushed, chaotic, as if something had pulled them away from their home in a moment of panic. Timothy felt his pulse quicken. Every instinct inside him screamed that something had gone terribly wrong. His eyes darted toward the staircase leading upstairs. The air felt heavier now, laden with a sense of impending dread. He walked toward the stairs, his hand gripping the banister tightly. He could hear his own breathing, shallow and uneven, but there was no sound coming from upstairs. No voices, no footsteps, not even the distant sound of a television playing. Nothing. At the top of the stairs, Timothy hesitated for a moment, his breath catching in his throat. The entire upstairs seemed shrouded in an unsettling quiet. Every step felt like it took him closer to something he wasn't ready to face, but something in him knew that he had to see this through. There was no turning back now. He passed the bathroom and turned toward the door at the end of the hall, the door to the twins' room. His hand shook as he reached for the doorknob. Slowly, he pushed the door open. What he saw inside would change everything. The discovery. The door to the twins' room creaked open slowly, its hinges protesting the movement in the silence that had thickened around him. Timothy's hand, still gripping the doorknob, trembled ever so slightly. His instincts, honed over years of service, screamed at him that this moment, this very moment, would be pivotal. He had been in countless homes, seen everything from joyous reunions to tragic scenes. But nothing had prepared him for what lay behind this door. The room was exactly as he remembered it. Soft pastel colors adorned the walls, with a gentle swirl of lavender, mint, and cream. A row of stuffed animals lined one shelf, their eyes staring blankly into the room as if frozen in time. The twin beds, each covered with fluffy quilts in shades of pink and yellow, sat at opposite sides of the room, as always. The air was still, the sunlight filtering through the curtains, casting a serene, almost dreamlike quality to the room. But something was wrong. Something that Timothy couldn't immediately put his finger on. He stepped further into the room, his footsteps almost soundless against the thick carpet. His eyes scanned the familiar space, looking for any clue that could explain the emptiness of the house. The gentle rhythm of his breathing filled the silence, each exhale feeling heavier than the last. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he took in every detail. It was the small things that began to unsettle him, the toys scattered on the floor, the dollhouse on its side, the drawing pads and crayons left abandoned in the middle of the room. Everything seemed unfinished. As if whatever had happened here had happened suddenly, with no warning. The toys were not placed where they usually were, and the room lacked the chaotic energy that typically filled the space when the twins were home. It was as though they had been taken mid-play, their laughter and voices abruptly cut off. His eyes fell to the bed closest to the window, the bed where Kayla usually slept. The blankets were a tangled mess, the stuffed bear that she usually hugged tightly was missing, its absence jarring. Beside the bed was a small wooden chair where Eliza's favorite book was always placed, but today, the book was gone. Timothy couldn't help but stare at the spot where it should have been, a heavy weight sinking into his chest. He walked toward the bed, trying to keep his movement steady, his mind working to piece together a narrative. As he approached, his eyes were drawn to something else, something small and pale on the floor near the corner. His heart skipped a beat as he bent down, reaching for the object with hesitant fingers. It was a piece of paper, a drawing, crumpled and smeared with what appeared to be dirt. He flattened it out carefully, his eyes scanning the childlike scrawl. It was a picture of the twins, drawn with crayons, their smiling faces clearly visible on the paper. But in the background, there was something darker. A large, shadowy figure, looming behind them, its features unclear but its presence unmistakable. It wasn't the sort of drawing a child would make unless something had disturbed them. The figure seemed too real, too menacing. Timothy's stomach twisted, his throat tightening as he processed the image. His hand gripped the drawing tighter, his fingers trembling as the sense of dread intensified. Why would they draw something like that? And why leave it here, in the middle of everything, as if they had been trying to say something? The air around him felt thicker, heavier, as though the room itself was pressing in on him, urging him to leave. But he couldn't, not yet. Not without understanding what had happened. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. As much as he wanted to leave this room, to escape the oppressive feeling that clung to him, he knew he had to continue. His duty was clear. He had to find answers. Turning his attention to the closet, he approached slowly, his heart pounding louder in his ears. The closet door was slightly ajar, and he could make out the outline of a few clothes hanging inside. But as he pulled the door open wider, the sight that met him took the breath from his lungs. It wasn't the clothes or the small items hanging in neat rows that shocked him, it was the emptiness. The shelves that should have held more toys, more books, were completely bare. Not a single item remained. He scanned the closet, looking for any sign of a struggle, any clue that could explain the sudden disappearance of the twins. But there was nothing. Only the hollow space where their belongings had once been. His eyes flickered to the wall beside the closet, and there, pinned to the wall, was something that made his blood run cold. It was another drawing. This one was different, more frantic, less orderly than the first. The lines were jagged, and the colors seemed rushed, like a child had been in a hurry to get it down. The drawing was of a house, the familiar yellow house with white trim. But the windows of the house were dark, the door ajar. In front of the house stood the same shadowy figure from the first drawing, its face now more defined, empty eyes, a wide grin, and hands reaching toward the drawn figures of the twins, who were fleeing from the figure, looking small and vulnerable in the face of it. Timothy's hand gripped the edge of the closet door for support as his legs threatened to give way beneath him. His mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fit together, but the more they did, the more horrifying the picture became. He knew, deep down, that these drawings were trying to tell him something urgent, something he wasn't yet ready to understand. He backed away from the closet, his breathing shallow, his head spinning. His gaze flickered to the window, and for a moment, he stood there, staring out at the quiet street. It looked so normal outside, so peaceful, and yet everything had changed. Something had happened to the twins, something terrifying. As he turned toward the door, he froze. There was a noise. A faint sound, barely audible over the deafening silence. It was coming from downstairs. A soft creak. Footsteps. Timothy's heart pounded in his chest as he instinctively reached for his radio, his hand moving toward his gun holster. The footsteps were slow, methodical, like someone, or something, was walking through the house. It wasn't a child's playful step, it was the sound of someone moving with purpose. Timothy's mind raced. Had someone broken into the house? Was the person responsible for the twins' disappearance still here? He took a deep breath, steadying himself. He had to investigate. He couldn't leave this unfinished. Whatever was happening, he had to confront it. Stepping cautiously out of the room, he moved silently down the hallway, his senses on high alert. His grip on the gun at his side tightened as he descended the stairs, each step bringing him closer to whatever waited in the shadows. And then, just as he reached the bottom of the stairs, he saw something that stopped him cold. On the far wall, beside the front door, there was a message. Scrawled in dark ink, smeared across the paint, were the words. "They know you're here. You're too late." Timothy's breath caught in his throat. His mind was reeling, but the one thing he knew for sure was this: whatever had happened to the twins, it was far from over. And whatever was lurking in the shadows, whatever had taken them, was still watching. The shadows stir. Timothy's pulse hammered in his ears as the words on the wall burned into his mind, the ink dark and ominous against the pale paint. "They know you're here. You're too late." The message seemed to grow heavier with every passing second, its meaning sinking deep into his bones, an overwhelming sense of urgency clawing at him. His breath came in short bursts, his mind racing to understand what he had just discovered, what it all meant. There was no time to waste. He couldn't afford to linger here, not when whatever force had taken the twins might still be nearby, watching, waiting. He had to act, and he had to do it now. Timothy's gaze shifted quickly around the living room, the familiar surroundings now twisted with the weight of the message on the wall. The furniture, the pictures on the walls, even the quiet ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, all of it seemed foreign, menacing in the new light of what he had uncovered. His fingers brushed against the cool metal of his gun holster as he silently moved back toward the door, his mind still clouded by confusion, yet sharp with the instinct to protect. The house felt colder now, as if the air had thickened with the presence of something unseen. He stepped lightly, careful not to make a sound, but every creak of the floorboards beneath his boots felt like a thunderclap in the oppressive quiet. The shadows seemed to grow deeper, more defined, as if they were closing in on him from every angle. But he didn't dare pause. He couldn't. Not with that haunting message on the wall still echoing in his head. Timothy's hand hovered over the door handle, but before he could turn it, the house seemed to shift. The quiet that had once settled like a blanket over everything now felt tense, full of silent movement, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, every sense on high alert. He had been a police officer for years. He had seen crime scenes, dealt with terrifying situations, but this was different. This was something he couldn't explain away, something beyond reason, beyond his understanding. And yet, he knew that it was real. Whatever had happened to the twins, whatever was lurking in the shadows of this house, it wasn't a figment of his imagination. It was real. And it was waiting for him. Before he could act on instinct and bolt out of the house, the sudden sound of a door opening upstairs froze him in place. His heart skipped a beat as the footsteps started again. Not slow, not hesitant. No, this time they were fast. They were purposeful. Someone, or something, was moving quickly, purposefully, through the house. Timothy's breath hitched in his chest, his entire body rigid with alarm. "Is anyone there?" he called out, his voice barely more than a whisper, swallowed by the silence that hung thick around him. His knuckles gripped the door handle, but he didn't move. Not yet. The footsteps grew louder, quicker, and they were coming closer. He exhaled sharply, his hand reaching toward the gun at his waist. His mind raced, trying to think of what to do, but the words, "You're too late," reverberated like a drumbeat in his head, drowning out every other thought. The words weren't just a warning. They were a threat. Timothy's breath came faster now, his thoughts a tangled mess of confusion and fear. Should he call for backup? No. He couldn't afford to waste time. Whoever or whatever had taken the twins was already 2 steps ahead of him, and time was slipping away faster than he could process. He had to confront whatever was in the house, alone, if necessary. The footsteps grew louder, and Timothy's muscles tensed in preparation. He hadn't even realized he was holding his breath until it came out in a sharp exhale. His eyes darted to the stairs, to the shadow of movement that seemed to appear at the top of the landing. Then, there it was. A figure. It was fleeting at first, a dark shape that appeared at the corner of the staircase. Too quick to get a good look, but unmistakable. Someone was up there. Someone who shouldn't be. Timothy's instincts screamed at him to move, to run, but his feet were frozen. The figure at the top of the stairs, tall, slender, yet somehow impossibly still, was looking directly at him. A shiver ran down his spine, and for a moment, he felt the unmistakable weight of being watched, of being trapped in a game where the rules no longer applied. He took a cautious step forward, his gun now drawn and held at his side, fingers steady as he approached the stairs. But the figure, whoever it was, didn't move. They simply stood there, motionless, staring down at him. A sense of dread settled like a heavy weight over Timothy's chest, his breathing quickening. Suddenly, the figure stepped back into the darkness of the hallway, disappearing from view. Timothy didn't think, didn't hesitate. His body moved before his mind could catch up, his legs carrying him up the stairs 2 at a time. He didn't know who it was, or what they wanted, but he couldn't stand by and let whatever it was, go unchecked. His boots hit the bottom of the landing, the thud of his steps drowned out by the increasing pounding of his heart. The house was quiet now, eerily so, as though everything had come to a halt. He scanned the hallway, his gun pointed toward the darkness at the far end of the corridor. And then he saw it. The door to the twins' room was slightly ajar. It wasn't closed like it had been moments before when he left. It was open just enough to let the shadows spill out into the hallway, and Timothy could feel the weight of them, the oppressive presence that seemed to be pulling him closer. With a surge of adrenaline, he moved toward the door, his hand tight on the handle. He pushed it open, his breath coming in short bursts, and the room beyond was empty. The same stillness that had settled over the house earlier had returned. The beds, the toys, the drawings, everything was as it had been. But something was off. It didn't feel right. It didn't feel like it was just a child's room anymore. It felt as if the room itself was a trap, waiting for him to step in further. He stepped inside cautiously, his eyes flicking around the space, searching for any sign of movement, any hint of danger. But the room was still. Too still. Then, in the corner of his eye, something flickered, a shadow, moving just beyond the edge of his vision. Timothy spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for the door to slam it shut. But the figure was gone, vanishing like smoke in the air. And that's when he heard it. A soft giggle. Childish. Innocent. But there was something wrong with it. It wasn't the kind of laugh that belonged in a room like this. It was hollow. Empty. Timothy's body froze. He knew this laugh. He had heard it 1,000 times before, as the twins played in the front yard, as they waved to him each morning. But this time, it was different. This time, it didn't come from the twins. The laugh echoed in his ears, growing louder, closer, as the shadows in the room seemed to deepen, stretching unnaturally toward him. And then, as the darkness swirled around him, the voice whispered. "You shouldn't have come here, officer." Into the abyss. Timothy's breath caught in his throat as the voice echoed through the room. His heart pounded, each beat louder than the last, as if the very air was being sucked out of him. The voice, a soft, chilling whisper, had no place in this house, in this space that had once been filled with laughter and light. His fingers tightened around his gun, his grip cold with sweat, his body frozen in place. For a moment, there was only silence, an almost oppressive stillness that clung to the room, making the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The giggle had stopped, but the lingering feeling of something watching him, something waiting, pressed in on him like the weight of 1,000 eyes. His mind screamed at him to leave, to get out of the room, but his legs refused to obey. He couldn't tear his eyes from the dark corner where the shadow had disappeared. For a moment, he almost thought it was gone. Maybe he had imagined it, the voice, the laugh, the oppressive sense of being watched. But then, the giggle came again, this time closer, clearer, echoing from somewhere behind him. The room itself seemed to breathe, its walls expanding and contracting with each eerie sound that filled the space. Timothy spun around, his eyes scanning every inch of the room in search of the source of the disturbance. His senses were on high alert, every muscle in his body wound tightly, his breath shallow and quick. But there was nothing. No one. "Who's there?" His voice was firmer this time, his tone steady despite the panic rising inside him. He strained his ears, hoping for an answer, but the only sound was the rustling of something unseen in the air. Then, the light in the room flickered. It was barely noticeable at first, a subtle dimming of the bulb overhead, like the house itself was exhaling, releasing some of the tension that had built up. But the moment the light dimmed, Timothy's gut clenched. The room no longer felt like a child's play area, or a place of warmth and comfort, it felt alive. It felt like it was breathing with a slow, heavy rhythm, pulsing like a dark heart, growing stronger and stronger with each passing second. He needed to act. He couldn't wait anymore. Timothy moved toward the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed thickest, clinging to the edges like a living thing. He hesitated for only a moment before stepping into the darkness, his eyes narrowing against the gloom, trying to find the source of the sinister energy that seemed to saturate the air. His boots made soft thuds against the carpet as he moved, every step careful, deliberate, as if the room itself was daring him to move forward. And then, in the far corner, he saw it. A small, hand-painted box, tucked into the space between two bookshelves, nearly hidden by the shadows. It was a simple thing, just a wooden box, its surface worn smooth by time, but the strange symbols carved into it made Timothy's blood run cold. They were symbols he had never seen before, twisted shapes that seemed to pulse with a life of their own, like veins stretching out across the surface of the box. They were the kind of symbols you only read about in ancient texts, in folklore and stories of dark magic, of things that lurked in the hidden corners of the world. He reached for it instinctively, his fingers brushing against the wood. The moment his hand made contact, the temperature in the room plummeted. A sharp, icy chill ran up his arm, and for a moment, he thought he heard the sound of a low growl, deep and guttural, rumbling from the depths of the walls. The box felt heavier than it should have been, and the weight of it pressed into his skin like a stone in the chest, suffocating him with its intensity. Without thinking, he lifted the box, his eyes never leaving the strange symbols etched across its surface. As soon as it left the shelf, the air around him shifted. The house seemed to groan, the very foundation of it shaking, as if something deep within was awakening. He tried to steady himself, but the box grew colder, heavier with each second. The symbols glowed faintly, a sickly greenish light that flickered in the darkness. And then, the room exploded into sound. The walls of the house seemed to buckle, the floor groaning as if something deep within the earth was stirring. Timothy staggered back, the box still clutched in his hands, and for a split second, he thought he heard a voice, low and thick, like a whisper from the abyss. "You shouldn't have disturbed it." The words seemed to reverberate through the very air around him, each syllable twisting and warping in his mind. The giggles were louder now, too, swirling around him like a storm, coming from everywhere at once. He looked frantically around the room, his vision swimming with the disorienting flicker of light. And then, as if from nowhere, a shadow, a dark, shapeless figure, lunged at him. It moved too fast. One moment, the corner of the room was empty, and the next, there was something there, a presence, massive, impossible, its form a writhing silhouette, shifting in the dim light. It had no face, no distinct shape, but its eyes, glowing red like hot coals, burned through the darkness and into his soul. The room seemed to twist as the figure moved toward him, and in that moment, Timothy knew that he was no longer dealing with a mere threat. This was something ancient, something predatory, something that had been waiting for this moment. His heart pounded in his chest as the figure stretched out long, impossibly thin limbs, each one ending in claws that scraped against the walls, leaving deep gouges in their wake. He could feel the pressure building around him, the air thickening until it was almost impossible to breathe. He tried to step back, but the room had already begun to close in on him. The walls seemed to bend inward, the very structure of the house warping under the influence of the shadow. He couldn't move fast enough. His limbs were frozen, paralyzed by the sheer force of the entity that loomed before him. He raised his gun, the weapon shaking in his hands, but it felt like it was too small, too weak to have any effect on this thing, whatever it was. "Please," he managed to whisper, his voice barely audible over the howling wind that seemed to swirl around him. "What do you want?" The figure seemed to pause, as if considering his question. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it tilted its head to the side, its hollow eyes burning into his. And in that instant, the room grew darker still, the shadows pulling in around them like a tide of darkness. "I want what was promised," the voice came again, low and gravelly, but somehow it seemed to reverberate through every part of Timothy's being. "I want what was taken." The words sent a chill down his spine, a realization slowly creeping in. This thing, it wasn't just hunting him. It was hunting something else. Something he hadn't yet understood. "Where are the girls?" Timothy asked, his voice rising in desperation. The figure's grin stretched wider, its form shimmering in the darkness. "They belong to me now." The words hit Timothy like a physical blow. His breath caught in his throat as the room around him seemed to fall into absolute chaos. The walls groaned and cracked, the floor buckled under his feet. And then, everything went black. The price of the unseen. The blackness seemed to envelop Timothy entirely. His body felt weightless, floating in a void of pure, suffocating silence. His mind raced, his heart hammering in his chest, but there was no air, no breath to sustain him. Time, too, seemed to stretch, twisting and distorting in the absence of reality. He tried to move, tried to find his bearings, but his limbs refused to cooperate, as if the very fabric of space itself had turned against him. Panic set in as his senses remained on high alert, but nothing, no sound, no movement, was able to break the crushing stillness. His thoughts were scattered fragments of fear, trying desperately to grasp at anything tangible, any shred of hope. Then, without warning, the world shifted. His feet found the ground again, solid, steady beneath him. The oppressive darkness began to recede, fading into soft, ghostly whispers that danced around the edges of his consciousness. The overwhelming sense of dread lifted slightly, but it left behind a strange, gnawing unease in the pit of his stomach. He could feel the presence of something immense, pressing in on him, though he couldn't quite define it. It was as though the very atmosphere around him was heavy with the weight of unseen eyes, watching him, waiting. Timothy's breath returned in short, uneven gasps, his body shaking with a cold that seemed to come from deep within, an icy chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the air. He looked around, his vision still blurry, but slowly, the outlines of a room began to come into focus. It was a large, cavernous space, lit by flickering torches mounted to the stone walls. The room was eerily quiet, save for the crackling of the fire. A strange smell hung in the air, damp, musty, like an ancient tomb. The walls were lined with shelves, each one packed with dusty books and scrolls, many of which were covered in strange symbols. The floor beneath his feet was uneven, made of dark stone, and the air felt thick, charged with an energy he couldn't quite place. It wasn't quite magic, nor was it natural. It was something else, something older. Timothy's eyes moved across the room, landing on a figure standing in the center. It was the shadow, the same dark, shapeless form he had seen earlier. But now, it was more defined. More real. The figure stood tall, its features more pronounced, though still hidden in the depths of shadow. Its eyes were glowing red, brighter now, pulsing with an unnatural rhythm that seemed to echo in the air. And as it turned its head toward him, Timothy felt an overwhelming force press against his chest, as if the very presence of this thing was draining the life from him. "I've been waiting for you, Officer Evans," the creature's voice boomed, filling the room with a deep, resonating sound. It was both a whisper and a roar, vibrating through his bones. "You've walked into something far beyond your understanding." Timothy's legs trembled beneath him, but he forced himself to stay upright. He had to face this. He had no choice. "What do you want from me?" Timothy's voice barely rose above a whisper, but it carried the weight of desperation. The figure tilted its head, a low, guttural laugh rumbling from its chest. The sound was like 1,000 whispers, all overlapping and twisting into one. "You think you can stop me? You think you can save those girls?" The figure took a slow step forward, and the room seemed to grow darker with every movement it made. "You're too late, officer. You've already disturbed the balance." Timothy's grip tightened around the box he had found earlier, still in his hands. It was the only thing that had given him any sense of power since he entered the house, the only tangible object in the midst of all the chaos. The symbols on the box pulsed with a faint greenish glow, matching the eerie light of the creature's eyes. "I'm not giving up," Timothy said through gritted teeth, though his voice quivered with uncertainty. He didn't know what he was up against, but he wasn't about to back down. The figure's laugh grew louder, more menacing. "You can't fight what you don't understand. This is far older than you, officer. It is far older than all of you." The creature's red eyes burned into his soul, and Timothy felt a pressure building within his chest. The creature's form shimmered and twisted, becoming more solid, more real with every passing moment. He could feel it reaching into his mind, trying to break him, to make him understand the futility of his resistance. "You're playing with forces you can't control," the figure continued, its voice now echoing in all directions. "The twins. Maya and Emma, they were chosen. They were meant to be part of the sacrifice. You can't save them. The price has already been paid." Timothy's heart sank as the figure's words hit him like a blow. The twins had been part of something dark, something that had been set in motion long before he had even known their names. But what could he do? How could he fight something that had already laid claim to their lives? He looked down at the box in his hands. The symbols were no longer just markings, they were alive, thrumming with dark energy. Timothy's mind raced. He had to find a way to stop this. To undo what had already been done. Please, Timothy muttered, his voice trembling. I can't lose them. The figure's eyes softened, but only for a moment, a twisted mockery of compassion. You already have, it said, its voice dripping with malice. And you will lose more before this is over. Timothy's thoughts were a blur as he tried to think of a way out. He needed to stop whatever ritual had been started, whatever dark magic had been unleashed. The twins weren't just innocent victims, they were pawns in something far larger. But what could he do against something that had been waiting, watching, and planning for so long? He raised the box again, desperate to do something, anything. The symbols on the box pulsed more fiercely now, sending sharp bursts of energy through his body. As he held it, something shifted. A pull. A force, almost magnetic, emanated from within the box. The air around him seemed to warp, and the figure in front of him froze, its glowing eyes narrowing. What are you doing? The creature snarled, its voice laced with fury. It took another step forward, but this time, it was slower, more cautious. Timothy gripped the box tighter, his knuckles white with strain. He didn't know what was happening, but he could feel the pull of something ancient, something that belonged to the box. It was as if it was calling out to him, urging him to unlock its power, to tap into whatever force it contained. The creature lunged toward him, but Timothy was already moving. With a roar of determination, he hurled the box toward the center of the room, where the shadows seemed to converge. As the box hit the ground, a bright light erupted from within, blinding him momentarily. He raised his arm to shield his eyes, and when the light finally receded, the creature was no longer there. The room was silent again, but this time, there was no tension, no feeling of imminent danger. The oppressive weight that had settled over the house lifted, and Timothy's heart slowed from its frantic pace. But there was still no sign of Maya or Emma. He had no idea what had just happened, or if the twins were safe, but he knew one thing for certain, the battle was far from over. The price had been paid, and there would be consequences.